Good morning. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, as you know, this week we organize a series of lecture on English literature. And you know, English literature is vast. That's why we are trying to understand the English literature in a particular century. In the previous lecture, we have tried to understand the English literature, early modern English literature up to the 18th century. Today we'll move further and we'll try to understand the English literature written in 19th century. And you know, literature is expression of what is happening in the society, what is happening in the politics, every aspect of life. So they got expression in the form of literature. So we'll try to understand the happening, what occurred during the 19th century. Also, the major contributor of the contribution in the English literature, and that we have nowadays for in the form of the books, or in the form of drama, in the other form of literatures. And for discussion on very topic, we have in studio eminent scholar Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya. He is a senior academician, administrator, scholar par excellence. He has experience of about 40 years as a teaching in English literature and no name in the field of English literature. He has also got opportunity serving as a vice chancellor of Kurukshetra University. And Professor Dahiya is also president of the Shakespeare Association, which brings out biannual journal on drama study, and that organizes association also organizes annual international conference on Shakespeare for popularizing the understanding of how to take up the work of Shakespeare and how to understand, give perspectives. So it has been very helpful, especially in the South Asian countries, and the Indian student has got the benefit out of it. And Professor Dahiya has written so many books, but the one book which is very popular is a new history of English literature among students and among academicians. It is very popular, that gives a perspective, that gives a kind of direction how to understand the English literature and how to take up the English literature for the further study. So on your behalf, I welcome Professor Dahiya for discussion on this topic, English literature during the 19th century. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Well, 19th century history of English literature, like any other history of any other age, is linked up with the past and, of course, looks forward to the future. In the past, we had the 18th century, which was politically conservative politics, dominated by monarchy. Philosophically, it had empirical thought, which was based on scientific rationalism and practical thinking. In literature, it was bound to the classical rules and followed the rules very strictly, leaving no scope for individual talent. It was in reaction to these things of the 18th century, politics, philosophy, literary theory, that we have in the 19th century a different kind of politics, different kind of philosophy, and different kind of literature. If you have a look at the history, when you come to 19th century, kings become weaker and parliament starts dominating for the first time in English politics. Although parliament had been there right from 1295, end of the 13th century, but it was more of a consultant body for the king, so that the king could know the grievances of the people. But from 19th century, parliament became supreme, and the prime minister rather than the king was ruling the country. That is why in 1832 the first reform bill came. Then in 1867 second reform bill came, and through these reform bills common people got political power and authority. So much so that in 1867 all workers were given the voting right. Of course, women still didn't have the voting right, but males of adult age, everybody got the voting right after 1867. So politics changed. Common man became important. Similarly, in literature, you find poets are singing about common people. Wordsworth is writing about the shepherd or the idiot boy or the leech gatherer. Small people, working people, it is about them that they are writing poetry. Whereas in the 18th century, Dryden, Pope, Johnson, etc., they were writing about the court, about the king, about the lords, big people, never about the common people. So it was for the first time that common people became the subject of literature in the 19th century. Similarly, in philosophy, there was a reaction against the empirical thought, because rationalism alone cannot know the truth about life and universe. So instead of rationalism, there came in philosophy what we call idealism. And this idealism was spearheaded by the Germans. We had first Hegel and then Kant. These were the two philosophers who wrote about idealism and had impact all over Europe. Actually, if you go into the history of idealism, you find it had Eastern origin, in fact Indian origin, because we in India had always believed that reality is inner, spiritual, and the material world is only a reflection, it is not the real reality. So idealism of the Germans also emphasized truth being internal and inner and not something verifiable by science or experiment. That is why in the 19th century English poetry also, the emphasis is upon the individual, not upon the general. In the 18th century, Johnson, the most important literary critic as well as poet, he used to say truths are only general. But then in the 19th century, William Blake, the first great romantic poet, he said to generalize is to be a fool, which means the truth is individual, and individual by his or her own experience realizes the truth. Just as in Indian philosophy, we believe that truth is to be apprehended through extra rational means. That is why we believe in meditation, we believe in contemplation. We go out in the hills and sit there alone and meditate to know the truth. So it was this kind of thought that came to dominate in the 19th century, and that is why the emphasis upon individualism and extrasensory perceptions. In the Romantic age, poets believe in dreams, they believe in visions, they believe in individual perception and not in rational or logical thought as the 18th century believed. Another influence in the Romantic age, the early 19th century, is called the Romantic age, later 19th century called the Victorian age. So the 19th century is divided into two parts, Romantic and Victorian. Another influence in the Romantic age, early 19th century, was that of Rousseau and Voltaire. These were the French thinkers. Rousseau, wrote Social Contract, and there also he said the famous statement, the very first sentence of the book is that man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Means the natural man is free, and natural man, there is perfect equality between man and man. It is only in this civilizational setup, in the societies, that we set up differences. We have classes, we have castes, we have all sorts of distinctions between man and man. Whereas nature makes no such distinction. Everybody is at par, everybody is equal. Similarly, in Romantic literature, you find poets are writing about individuals and their equality. They are not writing about lords or kings or princes and queens. They are writing about common people, and they are giving the status to the common person which was never attained earlier in the 18th or earlier centuries of English literature. So this was the influence of Rousseau, social contract. Rousseau also wrote his autobiography, which is still considered the most, honest, frank biography, where the writer is withholding nothing about himself. Even the weakest things about his person he is revealing. Even the most private and personal things he is revealing. The second important biography of this kind is Mahatma Gandhi's experiments, My Experiments with Truth, where again Gandhiji is not concealing anything. So this was the character of the Romantic literature, to lay bare your emotions, your thoughts, how you feel in private. So it is not the public man, it is not man in society, but man with himself or herself. That is the subject of Romantic poetry, the individual, the private, the personal self of the individual. So how you feel in the moments of joy, in the moments of sorrows. So those emotions are depicted in Romantic poetry. So Rousseau was a great influence, both in the honest rendering of one's emotions. That's why Wordsworth, the leader of the Romantic movement, he defined poetry as spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So it is attached to feelings, not to ideas or to thought. Whereas 18th century poetry was linked up with thought. It concentrated on thought, not on emotions, because emotions were distrusted. They were thought to be personal and private and not to be trusted because they are flimsy, transitory, and so on. Ideas are permanent. That's how they thought. But in the 19th century, it got reversed. Wordsworth also defined poetry as emotion recollected in tranquility. That is how he defines poetry. So the entire emphasis is on emotion, on emotional life, private life, personal life of every individual. Yet another influence on the Romantics was that of Voltaire. Voltaire was more of a skeptic. Skeptic is one who does not believe in faith, in religion. And not that he denies the existence of God, but he would say, I don't know. I can't confirm either yes or no, because I have no proof. So his skepticism also had an influence on the Romantics, because the Romantics are not the great believers in religion. Neither Blake nor Wordsworth, of course, in his later age, he turned to religion, but that was after he had done most of his poetry. Coleridge, a philosopher influenced by the Germans. And then the second generation, Byron, Shelley, and Keats, second generation of the Romantics, they were equally skeptical. Byron was outright against orthodoxy, conservatism, a blind faith in religion. He was against it. So was Shelley and Keats. So all of these poets of the Romantic age were influenced by German idealism and then French naturalism of forgot his name, Voltaire and Rousseau. Yeah, Rousseau's naturalism, excuse me, and Voltaire's skepticism. So idealism, naturalism, skepticism. These were the three major influences of philosophy, of thought on the Romantic literature. In politics, as I said, it was the expansion and strengthening of democracy and parliament, common man's importance. So these two combined constitute the major components of Romantic poetry. Among the poets we know William Blake was the first one, whose songs of innocence and experience came out in 1789. That is considered to be the beginning of Romantic literature. Some historians, of course, would date it with 1798, when Wordsworth and Coleridge combined. They wrote their lyrical ballads. So first publication of lyrical ballads, that was considered the document of Romanticism, because Wordsworth also wrote a long preface to the ballads explaining how this new poetry is different from the poetry of the earlier age. Then Coleridge, of course, is known for his interest in supernaturalism. Again, something which the 18th century would not accept, because they will accept only things rational and logical. But Coleridge, wrote Kubla Khan, where there is the supernatural. Even in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, that famous ballad based on popular ballad, there also there is the role of the supernatural. So this belief in supernatural, belief in extrasensory perceptions like dreams, myths, legends of the medieval times, there was a revival of all this in the Romantic age. And there were, of course, Walter Scott, another important poet, Robert Southey, another important poet. That was the first generation. In second generation, we have Byron, Shelley, and Keats. We know their important poems. Byron wrote Childe Harold, and he made that famous statement often quoted, that overnight I found myself to be famous just with the publication of his first poem, Childe Harold, Part 1. And then later, of course, he wrote still longer poem and a more important one, Childe Harold was the first one, Don Juan. Don Juan was his later poem, and a more mature and a longer poem, both voluminous books by themselves. Then Shelley, of course, is best known by his shorter poems, West Wind, Ode to the West Wind, for example. Then he wrote on liberty, because he believed in the freedom of the individual, every common man, and so on. So in a way, revolutionary in their own ways. Second generation of these younger romantics, they were more radical, both Byron and Shelley, although they were sons of lords. But then they revolted against their own families, their own class, their own conservatism, and that's why they were turned out of the university also. Shelley was expelled from Oxford because of his radical views. He signed a document saying an atheist means non-believer. So this would not be tolerated in the conservative universities like Oxford. So he was expelled. He's a non-believer, doesn't believe in God, therefore expel him. But he wouldn't mind. Both he and Byron, they settled in Italy because they were expelled from the country also in a way, because country was not welcoming their views. Byron was still more radical, and he was a craze with young people because he had real revolutionary ideas, and he rejected conservatism wholesale, and he was a worshipper of persons like Napoleon, a great personality, and he himself saw in Napoleon his own self, his own great mind, and so on. Keats, of course, is famous for his odes and a long poem called Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion, but mostly known for his odes. And he was technically more sound than any other romantic poet. That's why he's compared to Shakespeare and Keats, and he was a great admirer of Shakespeare also. That's why he was not very enthusiastic about Wordsworth, his own leader of the Romantic movement, because he accused Wordsworth of egotistical sublime, means too much full of himself and is not able to see things objectively. Whereas he said Shakespeare had the quality of negative capability. Negative capability means you negate your own self and have the capability to become every other self. That's why Shakespeare could create 39 plays and hundreds of characters, and he would become every character when he is writing about that character. So that dramatic ability to become every other self is missing in a poet like Wordsworth, who is full of himself and can only write about his person and cannot think about other people. So that was Keats's objection to his kind of egotistical sublime. So there is a difference between the first generation of the Romantics and the second generation. The second generation is more radical, and more radical because by that time the politics and philosophy both in England had become more radical, more active, more individual based and more democracy based, which was not the case with the first generation. Now in the Romantic age, poetry of course is said to be lyrical because it's a poetry which addresses only emotions, how you feel about things, about life, about the sorrows and joys. So the entire emphasis is upon emotional response of every individual. Obviously, the poetry that would result will be lyrical. So you have lyrical poetry, very little dramatic poetry. Not that they did not attempt drama, they tried their hand. Byron wrote like Manfred and Cain, these two plays. Even Shelley wrote Prometheus Unbound. But they are more of dramatic poems rather than dramas. Dramas are like Shakespeare, where you create characters and every character exists in his own right. In the romantic drama, there is hardly any character to be remembered. They don't have personalities of their own. They are merely mouthpieces of the poet himself. So you have very little drama in the age of Wordsworth. That's why even long poem like the epic was not possible, because it was a lyrical age, and the entire poetry, it may be drama, it may be novel, it may be short poem, it tends to be lyrical. You think of the novel also. There was novel in the Romantic age. You had Walter Scott to begin with, and Walter Scott wrote historical novels. He was a Scot from Scotland. But then when it came to the publication of his novels, he said, don't give my name, publish them anonymously, because he thought, as a lord, he was lord, you see, Lord Walter Scott, that it would be beneath his dignity to be known as a novelist, because novel had not acquired prestige by then. Poetry alone, poetry and drama, they were considered proper literature, and novel was some kind of writing for the common people, for lower classes and so on. So obviously Lord would not accept. It was only later that the name was given, many years later, after they were published. But to begin with, no, he wouldn't give. Another novelist of the age who is better known was Jane Austen. Jane Austen wrote those novels like Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, etc. So many. And she is one of the major novelists. So, novel of sensibility it is called. Sensibility because, again, like romantic poetry, the emphasis is upon the individual feeling, individual's private life. So she is writing about the love affairs of girls and so on. But then the focus is on the sensibility of the characters rather than like the 18th century. 18th century was more of a comic, epic in prose. Henry Fielding, or you see, he was representative. Like Joseph Andrews, one of his novels, is best known as a comic epic in prose, but not the novels of Jane Austen, which are novels of sensibility. So this was the picture of the Romantic age, where every form of literature, be it poetry or drama or novel, all tends to be lyrical, because the spirit of the age was lyrical. When you come to the later 19th century, this is called the Victorian age. The Queen Victoria, you know, became the Queen of England in 1834 and continued up to 1901. A very long innings she had. So from that year onward, it is considered the Romantic age, Victorian age, after her name. But then there were other influences coming into the literary writings in the later 19th century. One of the major influences was realism and naturalism. You know, meanwhile, Darwin had come, and Darwin had made discoveries. Origin of species, you remember? He said God did not create the universe. Species have developed from the jellyfish to man through monkey and other stages. So he gave a new perspective altogether. It was a shock to the world, but ultimately he had to be believed because he had lifetime experiments on his side, whereas Christianity or any other religion was only a matter of faith. Nobody could really prove that God created the universe, but he proved how species have evolved themselves and how from the fish you have now man who is all powerful and so on. So that was a great influence, and that affected literature in the sense that if literature became more realistic. So realism came in, and naturalism also, because he based his experiments on two things primarily. One was heredity, and the other was environment. He says life is conditioned by these two factors. You inherit certain things from your parents, from earlier generation, and the kind of environment in which you are living, physical environment, social environment, political environment. You see, that is going to influence your making, what kind of person you become. So he says these are the two influences on every species, and that is how they develop, conditions develop. A mouse will have its own conditions of existence, and therefore it has to find ways to survive. So it will dig a hole and live there and so on. Similarly, other species. So it is the conditions of life, environment and heredity, these two influences. So they came into literary writing also, naturalism. Hardy, for example, Hardy shows in his novels the influence of heredity, the influence of environment, both, and becomes more of a naturalist. Naturalism, of course, was stronger in the French literature, like Balzac, Stendhal. There you find them practicing to the book naturalism. In English novel, of course, they are not practicing it to the book, but influence can be seen. The difference between Romanticism and Victorianism is that in Romanticism there was a reaction against 18th century, and therefore action and reaction as it goes in science are equal and opposite. That is what Newton had discovered. And in reaction you go to the other extreme. If 18th century was too much rule bound, 19th century was breaking all rules, boundlessness and free play of the emotion. Now what the Victorian age did was retain the essentials of Romanticism but moderate it with reason. So they tried to bring about a compromise. That is why there is a famous phrase called Victorian compromise. So Victorians tried to compromise between Romanticism and Classicism, between Darwin and Christianity. So they tried to reconcile, and they showed that Darwin, whatever Darwin is saying, is already there in Bible. Bible does not deny evolution, so on and so forth. So in poetry also there is moderation. You do not find it to be very lyrical, because there are rules observed, like Matthew Arnold, for example, before him Tennyson, then Browning. All of these three poets, they are very different from Wordsworth, Coleridge or Byron, because there you find technical flaws in the Romantic poetry. There you find total defying of classical rules. But in the Victorian age they are not defying. They are trying to reconcile the individual spirit, the free play of the emotion, but it is to be contained within the forms, within the norms of rules of different forms of literature. Is it all right? Or
Yeah, it's all right. You continue.
Okay.
Okay. So, as you were talking about the, I start with the Romanticism to the Victorian age. First, we find that the writing space which the Romanticism people, author or writers find, they from the action reaction point of view. So, when we talk about the general masses, the general publics, so who were the writer who were representing the general masses of the times?
Mm-hmm. Well, prose and fiction, these two came up for the first time as the literature of the common people. In fact, novel started as literature of the common people, because earlier drama and poetry, they were considered high class.
So that was dominating the writing space.
Yeah. So high class literature and high gentry, they will go to the theatre, they will enjoy it, and they will appreciate satire, irony, invective, and so on. Common people would not know all that. Unless you have education in Oxford and Cambridge, you can't appreciate all that. So common people will not be admitted to these elite universities. Even today in England, university means Oxford and Cambridge.
Right.
Although there are hundreds others, but they will not accept them as proper. So all the high class people, these lords and their families, they will send their children only to these two universities, not to any other, however good it might be. So that mindset. So novel came up as literature of the common people, because education now was expanding. Common people were also getting education, maybe in government schools, ordinary schools, but they were called grammar schools.
Okay.
Like we call them government schools, they had grammar schools there. Even Shakespeare studied in a grammar school, not in an elite school,
Right.
because he was not from the family of lords. So novel and then prose essay. You remember Hazlitt, William Hazlitt and Charles Lamb. They were famous, essay writers of the Romantic age, and they popularized literature, and common people were reading them. Then they were reading the novels of Walter Scott and Jane Austen. They were also very popular. So popular fiction, popular prose came up as literature of the common people in the early 19th century.
Okay.
In the later 19th century, it became all the more popular, because novel came to dominate, and it was no longer a stepbrotherly treatment. It was not receiving.
Well, they acquired significance in a very short period of
Yes.
time. Yeah. The other point I'd like to ask you, as you said that Romanticism writers, they were breaking the rules. They were not following the rules. But on the other hand, you say that they were being influenced by the idealism and writing of Rousseau, Voltaire. So in a way, they are again sticking to something which is, but my point is not a selfless expression. They were getting something from others, and that was being expressed.
Yeah, of course. No literature, I would say, is without the influence of history and philosophy. That is why Aristotle had said.
No, you
long
find
ago.
parallel in the India. Premchand,
Yeah.
he was giving expression to the voiceless, voice to the voiceless.
Yes.
So do we find such parallel in the English literature?
Yeah, of course. Even Wordsworth, writing for the first time, writing a poem about a shepherd, writing about a servant girl, writing about an idiot boy, so on and so forth. Ancient mariner is a common fisherman. So this was for the first time.
But these are in writing in an isolation, not documenting the sequencing, or we can say sequencing the events what we find in the Premchand writing.
Yeah, of course. That is possible only in the novel,
Okay.
which came in the Victorian age.
Okay.
In the Victorian age, you find everything happening in society is coming into fiction. George Eliot, Thomas Hardy, Gaskell, so many other novelists, they are coming up, and novel in a big way starts dominating, which means common man now is dominating the society. They have the voting right, they form the majority. Similarly, prose fiction came to dominate literature. So that influence is very much there.
Okay, kids writing also we find that they broke the boundaries, come out from, and people even from Indian they write, they cite, they give an example. What is the beauty of that?
Well, I see Indian influence on the romantics in the sense that we have through the ages believed that reality is spiritual. It is not material. In the 18th century, you see, empirical thought, they believed that reality is material, which can be verified, which can be proved through experiment, logic, rationality, and so on. But we have always believed no, reality is beyond that. Rational mind cannot comprehend the mysteries of the universe, and therefore you have to take to other means like meditation. Buddha and other, you say, saints, for years and years they are meditating to know the inner truth, spiritual truth. So romantics also said the truth is inner, truth is spiritual, truth is not material, what you see. It is to be felt, it is to be experienced. It cannot be just seen or studied. So that influence, of course, it came through the Germans.
Okay.
And if you remember, Germans were the first who translated our Upanishads and Vedas, and that is how it became available to Europe. S.T. Coleridge was the first Englishman or romantic who went to Germany, and with Schlegel brothers and others he interacted. He studied all this and came back to England and spread these ideas. And from England it went to America, which they call transcendentalism and so on, which again is Indian influence. So Indian spiritualism is at the back of the British romanticism.
Okay. So the interaction with the Indian classical literature, we can say the Vedas, Upanishads, other forms.
Thought.
Gave a new kind of insight into the world of literature, even English literature, and that in course of time they also got a good space in the English literature.
Yeah, of course the British romantics are not directly acknowledging this.
Yes.
Maybe they are not even aware of it directly, because they know only the Germans. But then the Germans were in direct contact and they were doing this job. Whereas later when it reaches America, the American writers are acknowledging it. You see, Thoreau, for example, in his Walden, he speaks of the Ganges and he says the water of the Ganges mixes here with the water of my pond.
Right.
So spiritual unity, spiritual oneness of life in the universe. Similarly, beside the leading American transcendentalist or a poet, Emerson. Emerson wrote poems on Brahma. One of his poems is titled Brahma Alone, and another is Paramatma, over soul. So all these were Indian ideas which travel from India to Germany to England to America. So that is the root. But then the influence can be very well studied. Some scholars have done that study also, but it is very apparent.
Okay. So, the old writer or the old people might not be acknowledging such, but what about the new study being carried out in the Oxford University, Cambridge? Are there any kind of shift in their thinking or the finding out the origins of such kind of new?
No,
looking?
of course not. You see, their sense of superiority
Are still prevailing.
is still prevailing. They think they know more than we would know.
Okay.
Or if spiritualism the Indians have, let them have it. It's of no use to us. See, they will think like this. Of course, one change one can see in the Western universities, including Oxford, Cambridge. Now they have departments of South Asian studies,
Okay.
and they have departments of Oriental studies, and so on. But you see, overall, the impact of those studies are not there in the life of the Englishman or life of the university even. They are separate departments doing their own whatever, but you cannot say that it has had any social, intellectual or philosophic impact
Okay.
on them.
So, okay, you have worked on this line many years, and you know the Indian perspective and their perspective. So, what is the major other differences apart from this, from reading English literature from Indian perspective and the Western perspective? What are the other distinguishing point that either academician or a student following in reading or in researching or documenting a new kind of knowledge?
Well, these days there is a movement we call post-colonialism, where scholars are reinterpreting. Scholars, both creative writers as well as literary critics. Literary critics are reinterpreting the texts produced during the colonial period,
Okay.
because those texts carry the perspective of the rulers, of the Englishmen, and they had their own opinions about us, and not very flattering opinions. They would rather think very low of us and very backward, uncivilized, so on and so forth. Orthodox people. Now we are reinterpreting and showing them that your opinions were biased.
Okay.
We are not inferior to anyone, so on and so
Okay.
forth.
So,
So that movement is very strong, even in creative writing, like Salman Rushdie, Midnight's Children, and so on. So post-colonial novel, post-colonial literary criticism, both emphasize this post-colonial perspective, our own perspective being dominant
okay.
rather than theirs.
Okay, so the point here is they have their own context, text and context. So we need to not only just to reorient the studying it, we also have to give a new context in which that in all English literature need to be revisited.
Yeah, of course. That is why history becomes very important, because every literature is influenced by the environment, and therefore unless you relate it to the environment of the time, that we were slaves to the British, they ruled us, so obviously there will be one kind of conditioning of their mind and our mind also, and now it is very different. But then, as I always say, post-colonialism also is a reaction to colonialism, and therefore, like the Romanticism reacting against neoclassicism and going to the other extreme, post-colonials also go to the other extreme.
Okay.
They forget that there are certain qualities of literature, the real qualities of literature, which are beyond these questions of politics, nationalism, racism, and so on.
Okay.
Why do we read Kabir today? Why do we read Ramayana and Mahabharata? Because they are so old texts. Why do we read Homer and Shakespeare? Because there are certain universal qualities. They speak to humanities, not to an Indian or to the British or to the Burmese. Literature is not in that sense nationalistic or racist or promoting this politics or that nation. No. Writers at Tagore used to say that we write for the humanity, for mankind. we do not write for any particular group of people.
You're right.
So the post-colonials forget that, because they are hung up with merely bringing out the post-colonial perspective. That is all right, but then you have to go further. You have to bring out the best qualities of literature. You see, Premchand speaks to us very strongly, not because of historical things, but because he has universal things to say.
Right. Now, post-colonial, apart from the post-colonialist approach, we also have a post-modernist approach. How the postmodernists will look at this literature?
Well, postmodernism is both a reaction against modernism as well as an extension of modernism.
Yeah.
Well, modernism came in the early 20th century, after World War I, because there was reaction against humanism. Right from Renaissance, 15th century to the end of the 19th, there was the vogue of humanism. Everybody believed in humanism and those values, humanistic and so on. But First World War gave a shock to the writers, and they said, what use is humanism? What happened to humanism? People went mad, killing each other, millions of people killed and so on. So they lost faith in humanism, and modernism went back to medievalism. Eliot Pound, they are talking of the medieval Christianity and continuity of their civilization and so on. That was one reaction. Second was losing faith in all religions and becoming nihilistic, skeptical and so on. So these two influences went side by side in the modernism, and modernism became experimentation, exploration of new grounds, new ideas, because the old ideas and old forms have failed. So modernism was known for experimentation, whereas postmodernism, so far as experimentation is concerned, it is a continuation of modernism. But it is a reaction against modernism in the sense that there came a new element of absurdism, what is called the absurd drama, for example, or philosophy of the absurd, which believes that the entire existence of man is absurd, because the universe is natural, but man is looking for morality. We always look for justice. If something happens to somebody, you will say, what wrong has he done? Why did God punish him? Even you see, gentle people, good people, they suffer. Why do they suffer? So we are looking for moral justice in the universe. But universe is Darwinian. There is struggle for existence, there is survival of the fittest. You can't say that it is a moral world. So the absurdist says man is placed in an absurd position because he is looking for something which is not there. So in such a situation, what do? They say you laugh it away, because you can't have any remedy for it. The conditions of life will remain as they are. So why be depressed? So they have a phrase called cheerful nihilism. You have lost faith in God. There came a philosopher, German again, Nietzsche. So Nietzsche gave the philosophy of death of God. He says there is no God. It's a godless world. And therefore there are no shared values. Nobody can say what is good and what is bad, what is moral and what is immoral. Everybody decides for himself or herself. So he brought in perspectivism, that everybody has his or her own perspective. I may say, no, I don't believe in this. So the I comes first these days rather than community values, shared values. So death of God theory. So after that, they said, if you don't believe in anything, at least be cheerful, because life has to be lived through. So you can live it either miserably or happily. So why not live happily?
Okay.
So cheerful nihilism,
That is the
that is postmodernism.
postmodernism. So of course they will look at the these texts in a way that will give a cheer to people, not will bring a concrete sort of the things. I think.
Yeah, that's why in postmodern literature you have lot of comedy, satire,
Yeah.
parody, making people laugh. You see, the greatest comedy of the 20th century was Catch 22.
Okay.
Film also you must have seen.
Right. So, well friends, it was indeed refreshing to go through the 19th century literature and coming to know all these aspects. We hope that you must have benefited, and how we'll take up the text and context together to reach your conclusion, right conclusion, we say that. For that we need both text and context. So, with this word we conclude the lecture. I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on your behalf I thank Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya for giving such an insightful lecture on this topic. Thank you very much.